All right, welcome everyone. We are at round 6 in the Stockholm Interzonal 1962, and Fischer had a really good start with 4 out of 5 before this game against Gedeon Barcza. I think maybe Hungarian player. Should have looked that up, but I think that's correct. And Fischer is playing white. So let's see here. All right, he starts with one e4, and Barcza plays the Caro-kann c6, and this was probably one of the last games where Fischer still played this 2 knights variation. So he began with knight c3, and he experimented basically a lot in his career. He also played a lot of simultaneous in 1964, where he tried some different things, but I wouldn't say that he really had a set repertoire against the Caro-kann. He played all sorts of stuff like the King's Indian attack and even the classical and even exchange variation as well. Barcza chooses d5 here, of course. White plays knight f3, takes on e4. I think also bishop g4 is a candidate. We also saw this specific 2 knights variation in round 4, but in that case, in this position in round 4, Fischer opted Portisch opted for a knight to d7, but in this game knight f6 was played. So doesn't seem to be a very ambitious move, but it also creates some kind of imbalance here. Fischer decides to take on f6, and both captures are possible. Black can capture with the e-pawn. He can also capture with the g-pawn. I would say if he captures with the g-pawn, it becomes very unbalanced, the structure. Probably black will have to castle long, I guess, in that line. But after this decision, e takes f6. Black has a pawn majority on the king side with those 4 pawns against those 3, and white has a pawn majority 4 versus 3 on the queen side. And in a pure pawn endgame, I would say this would be probably a decisive advantage for white to have this structure, especially if both kings are placed on the king side, because then basically to defend, black has to spend a lot of tempos moving the king to the queen side to defend, so that would be a huge advantage for white. And if you look at the pawns, those pawns are not very mobile. They're a little bit crippled, and it will be very difficult for black to create some kind of passed pawn in an endgame with those pawns. So long term, a position like this is probably favoring white, and in general, white would be happy just to trade pieces as long as he doesn't really change the structure. So that would be a good plan. And black would probably be interested to keep the game in a middle game, like keep things complicated and dynamic as far as possible, I would say. Fischer continues with d4, claiming a stake in the center, and Barcza develops the bishop to d6, probably the most active square for this bishop. White plays bishop c4, and Barcza decides to castle short. So maybe this structure maybe have some defensive pluses to have this extra pawn controlling some squares, but you really need to keep the game probably in the middle game for black here. White continues with short castle. We have rook e8, and we have the bishop b3. It looks like kind of a cautious move. Could be that white wants to see a little bit more how black plans to develop the pieces. But this kind of bishop maneuver, like bishop c4 and tucking the bishop back to b3, there was many times in the Sicilian where Fischer played similar maneuvers with his bishop, the light squared bishop. So black continues with knight d7. I would say a very natural looking move would be to play just bishop g4 to develop this bishop, and then probably afterwards play knight d7 and maybe try to prepare c5 or something like this. Looks like a very natural continuation, especially creating this pin where white doesn't have the ability to block. I mean, his bishop is a little bit can't really block this pin with bishop e2, so bishop g4 looks kind of natural, also creating some kind of pressure against the d4 pawn by pinning the knight on f3. But instead Barcza decides to play knight to d7, and Fischer continues with knight h4. Interesting move, trying to take aim for the f5 square, maybe taking some advantage that this pawn is no longer able to control the f5 square. So if you manage to get the knight here, black would either have to trade or he need to play maybe g6, creating some problems and weakening the kingside structure. So knight h4 is interesting. Black continues with the knight f8. And we have queen to d3, securing the f5 square. Black plays bishop to c7. White plays bishop e3. So white connects the rooks here, and he basically finishes the development with this move bishop e3. Black is a little bit more passive, and he still needs to develop the queen side, the rook and the bishop. Black continues with queen to e7, and white jumps into the center or to the f5 square with a knight. And Barcza decides to offer a pretty early queen trade, which I already mentioned that I think any kind of trades would probably benefit white, who has this promising endgames with a pawn majority on the queen side. So it looks a little bit wrong, this queen e4, to offer the trade, and Fischer immediately takes on e4. So we have some kind of simplification of the position. The knight goes back to g3, black plays rook e8, and then we have a slight structural change, but trading those two pawns is not any kind of problem for white, because he still maintains his 3 versus 2 majority if those pawns are traded. It just frees up white's position a little bit, and he also gets his bishop to a very nice diagonal, so he can pressure on this diagonal against the b7 pawn. Also the other bishop is targeting a7, so these very active bishops kind of tie down black to defending those pawns on the queen side already, which is a good sign for Fischer. Black plays bishop e6, bishop takes, a takes. Let's see what we have here. Yeah, we have another trade with this bishop e6, but doesn't really seem to help black too much, this trade, because now we just have two very weak pawns on the queen side. They don't have any pawn protection, so looks kind of bad for black, I would say. White plays a very solid move. He goes a3 here, and this little move, a3, makes sure that the bishop doesn't have to keep track of this pawn on a2 or this rook, so both those pieces are freed up. So that's a very nice little move. Black activates the rook with rook a5. Instead of moving the bishop, Fischer plays rook to d1. I guess if you play c4, there is a risk that black can start trading these two pawns, which would probably benefit black to get rid of this weakness. So instead, Fischer plays rook to d1. We have rook c5 targeting c2. White continues with playing those small moves, c3. So this is definitely not a game of fireworks, but it's a very subtle game and maneuvering. And Fischer gets a chance to show how to take advantage of those small advantages. We got rook to c7. He tucks the bishop back to f3, maintaining focus on this pawn. So black is a little bit tied up. He has those two weaknesses to worry about. And those weaknesses are not really going away, because I think for the rest of the game, black shouldn't even be able to, I mean, white has such control over these weaknesses, so he cannot do too much. He can just play passive here, black. Black plays rook to d7. And we have rook takes, knight takes d7, and white finds an opportunity to head back to f5, because now there is also this weak d6 square. So very active pieces here by white. Knight goes to c5, and we have knight to d6, rook to d8. Everything's okay with the coffee, or? Alright, let's see, knight to d6, rook to d8. And now we have this knight takes c8, rook takes c8 transformation. And unfortunately for Barcza, we are entering perhaps a very special phase of the game, because this endgame is actually the bishop and rook versus knight and rook situation. Nowadays it's known as the Fischer Endgame. So he was known to really handle those situations very well, and showing the superiority of the bishop in many positions. There is one famous game that you might want to look at. It's Fischer versus Taimanov in 1971. I'm not sure exactly, because they played a candidate match, so I'm not sure what number that game was, but definitely worth to look at that game. Fischer was playing white in that game. Let's see how Fischer handles this endgame. White plays rook to d1, and we have king f8, rook to d4. So it looks like Fischer, I mean, it's too difficult to attack this pawn from d6. So Fischer basically aims to attack the pawn from b4 and then keeping the bishop here on b7. And the following move, I'm not really sure why it was played h3, but I guess Fischer's just very patient here. He feels that black doesn't have any kind of counterplay, and he can just play play the game very slowly. So Barcza decides to play f5, and we have this rook b4, very nice placed rook. It's both defending white's only potential weakness on the queen side, and it's also attacking the b6 pawn. So this rook is quite much stronger compared to this one. And Barcza continues with a knight to d7. So white doesn't want to do too much with his pawn structure. I think it's perfect the way it is. So, and those two pieces are very well placed. So Fischer continues improving his king. King f1. We have king e7, king e2, king to d8. Fischer plays rook b5. And the point of this move is that you don't mind maybe if black plays g6, you will have all those pawns placed on light squares, which would be potential targets for this bishop in some situation. Also, if black plays g6, you create a lot of weaknesses on the dark squares where maybe white king can enter at some point. So those kind of ideas are very important in these kind of endgames, to create entry squares for your king. Black plays g6, white plays king e3, so you have some different options available. He could try to get to the b4 square, maybe even the b5 square with his king. Maybe he can go this way and then move the rook and place the king here. He also have the options to enter some dark squares with the king, or try to do it. Black plays king c8, so this move frees up the rook. Maybe at some point this rook can try to get more active. White plays king d4, and we have king b8, opening some options, maybe rerouting the rook. We have king d5. So white is just checking a little bit if he can enter some squares, and black blocks this attempt. So Fischer he's just probing a little bit to see if there's some kind of weaknesses anywhere. Rook a6, a4, gaining a little bit of terrain and having some control over b5. King to c7, pretty good square for the king, controlling or defending both these two pawns. So we have a5, kind of a tactical shot, because if black takes, white would just take this pawn, and the a5 pawn would be pretty weak, and probably black wouldn't be able to defend it. We got rook to d6, bishop d5, making sure this rook is very passive. And we have king c8, so black doesn't have too many active plans. He's just trying to survive move by move, basically. We got a takes b6. And now we got f6. Not really sure why he didn't just take back, but maybe there's some reason for it. Yeah, probably the reason is that this pawn would have been lost. So white plays king e3. We got knight takes b6. Bishop g8. So Fischer basically accepts the invitation to pick off some pawns on the king side. Black plays king c7. Rook c5 check. King goes to b8. He don't want to play this move because in case this bishop takes... Yeah, I'm not really sure why he didn't do that actually, but okay, rook to c5, king b8, bishop takes h7, and now knight d5. So black has a plan here. he wants to try to surround this bishop and make sure it cannot get back to the game, and then maybe try to pick up this bishop. So knight d5 check, intending this reroute. And now basically from e7 the knight is dominating the bishop, so we are covering some important squares with this knight. And maybe if we get a chance we would like to play something like this, but Fischer isn't really allowing it, so he probably calculates this even before he takes the pawn. So he plays h4, black plays b6, we got rook b5, king to b7, and now h5, so this bishop is breaking out. We have king a6 attacking the rook. Fischer plays c4, stabilizing the rook. We got g takes h5, and now bishop takes f5. Fischer is offering a transition in the game that we go to a rook endgame, but in this rook endgame, if black takes and rook takes, then this pawn will fall, and those two pawns are just too strong, especially with the black king being too far away to be able to protect the king side. So yeah, that would probably be quite an easy convert. How do you say? It would be easy for white to convert that kind of advantage. We have rook to d4. Fischer plays b3. Knight goes to c6. King e3. Rook d8, bishop e4 attacking the h5 pawn. Knight to a5. Yeah, so if you take here, the knight will take on b3. Probably white is better, but bishop c2 is a much more solid choice because this pawn is so weak. And we got h4, rook h5, rook e8 check, king to d2. Let's see what we got here. Rook g8, counterattack on the g2 pawn. Rook takes. We got b5, rook f4. B takes c4. He doesn't take the pawn with check, which probably most players would have done, but he just simply takes back on c4. So black probably doesn't want to play this kind of move, so he takes on g2. Now he takes with a check. So this part is pretty easy to convert, I would say. You just have to play slowly and make sure that you don't miss some kind of tactics. You have king c3, rook g4 attacking the c4 pawn. And playing f4, white is starting to advance with the f pawn and cutting off the rook. So black's pieces are not really coordinated here, so should be quite easy to convert this kind of position. We have knight to b7 and king b4, and Barcza basically had enough. So this was a pretty long game, 64 moves. And after this game, I believe Fischer is at 5 out of 6. I also checked the tournament table, and I didn't check because I didn't have a complete tournament table, but I think 5 out of 6, he was probably maybe in the lead or shared lead or something, because it was a pretty nice start in this candidate tournament, 1962. So we'll be back. I'm not sure when I'm gonna do the next stream, and I'll also post it to YouTube, Pawn Structures at YouTube. So thank you very much, and see you next time.